Okay, I know it's a crappy thing to say, especially on a video. On the second packet, I messed up the first examples, so I wasn't happy with my explanation, so I transferred it to the sheet of scratch paper. Okay, same thing you have in front of you. Now the directions are find the quotient. Now yesterday we added with these are called complex numbers. I's are called complex numbers. Okay. We added with complex numbers, we subtracted, and we multiply without much problem. Now here's the worst part. Now you're going to find the quotient. That means divide. No, you don't just divide by this. You can't actually divide by a number with I. Okay. So what we have to do is get I out of the bottom. Okay, so here's the first problem. We have 5 plus 3i divided by 7i. 5 plus 3i divided by 7i. Okay, now, what we need to first do is get I out of the bottom. The dividing part's easy, but the issue is the I that's in the bottom. So here's what you do. You count how many terms you have on top. Okay. You count how many terms you have on bottom, which is 1. You have 2 terms on top, 1 on bottom. That's called a binomial on top, a monomial on bottom. But mono means 1. Then you put times, and you're going to times by a fraction. The fraction that you're timesing by has to have the same thing on top as it has on bottom. The numerator and denominator have to be equal. It's a fraction equivalent to 1. Now you look on the bottom. If you have just one term, then you multiply by I over I. Did you hear that? If there's only one term, you multiply by I over I. And then the i's each have one term. Okay, so I kind of put how many terms there are. Now here's what I do at that point. I make a fraction, and then I come over here and write, kind of split it into top and bottom. So you're taking a 2 by 1, so 2 by 1 is 2. That's 2 you have to find. You're going to take 5 times I, and then you're going to take 3i times I. So 5 times I is 5i, and that's in simplest form. 3i times 5i is 3i to the second, which yesterday is not, so that's 3 times negative 1, because I to the second is equivalent to negative 1, that's negative 3. So you put your constant first, negative 3, and then your I term second, 5i. Okay, now on the bottom, that's a 1 by 1, that's easy, that'd be 7i times I. So it'd be 7i to the second, and then that would be 7 times negative 1, and that's negative 7. Okay. Now, we're ready to divide, but before we do that, if you have a negative on bottom, you want to make it positive, and then your top terms just go to opposite, positive, negative. Okay. Now here's what you're going to do. I'm going to take a calculator. Now it's time for the dividing part now that the I is out of the bottom. So you take 3 divided by 7. That's a decimal, so you keep it 3/7. Keep it in fraction form. Then you take negative 5 divided by 7, decimal, so keep it as a fraction. Negative 5 over 7, I. Okay, there you go. Okay, you got to get repetition with this. Okay, 8 minus 6i divided by 3i. Okay, 8 minus 6i divided by 3i. So to divide, we got to get the I out of the bottom. Okay, you have 2 terms on top. I want you putting that 1 on bottom. So if you have just 1 on the bottom, remember it's all about the bottom. If you have just 1 term, you just multiply by I over I. And then each of those have 1 term. As long as there's 1 term on bottom, a monomial. Now we're going to find the products of the top and bottom separately, the numerator, denominator. 2 by 1, that'd be 2 products to find. 8 times I and then negative 6i times I. Okay, and then on the bottom it's just 3i times I. 1 by 1 is just one product you need to find. Put that there. Those little things in the circles, I want you, if you don't, people screw it up. So it's 8i, that's in simplest form, and that would be negative 6i to the second, but that is negative 6 times negative 1, which is 6. Now we have our top set, 6 plus 8i. Okay, the bottom it's 3i times I, and that's 3i to the second, but of course that's not simplified because it's 3 times negative 1, and that'd be negative 3. I don't like the negative on bottom, so make it positive, negative, negative. Okay. Okay, so first thing we do is divide negative 6 by 3. That'd be negative 2. Okay, it wouldn't be a decimal, so I put negative 2. Then negative 8 divided by 3, decimal, so just keep it negative 8 over 3i. Okay, that's how you divide. Okay, now I'm going to go into my packet because I gave a horrid explanation in the first video and I'm at home and don't have a second one. Okay, same thing, times, because you can't divide now, not with the I there, it doesn't work that way. Okay, so how many terms you got? You got 2 on top, that's good for later, but the bottom is what drives the process, just 1. So it's I over I again. And each of those have 1 term. See, if I put that there, I know how many products I have to find on the top and the bottom. Okay. I mean, what's 2 times 1? 2. Okay, 1 times 1 is 1. So, we take 8 times I, and we go to the 7i and take that times I. So it's 8i, that's simplified, but 7i to the second is not. That's 7 times negative 1, negative 7. You're supposed to put your negative 7 first. If you don't, I'm not going to be mad. Okay. Now bottom 1 by 1, it's just 2i times I. So it's 2i to the second. Okay. But that's not simplified because that's 2 times negative 1, which is negative 2. Positive, positive, negative. I'm doing that so I can make my bottom positive. Okay. 7 divided by 2, no decimals please, put 7 over 2. It's kind of, negative 8 divided by 2 is not a decimal, that would be negative 4, and then I goes behind it. Okay, next problem. 6 plus 7i divided by negative 5i. In order to divide, we have to get the negative 5 out, the I out of the numerator. Okay. So that has 2 terms, that has 1 term. If the bottom has 1, it's just I over I, and each of those have 1, okay? So now we have a game plan for the multiplication. So 6 times I, and then 7i times I. If you want to put a 1 in front of the I, you're more than welcome to, okay? It's not going to change anything. It'd be 6i, and then 7i to the second. That's in simplest form. That is not, because that's 7 times negative 1, which is negative 7. Okay? So you have negative 7 plus 6i. Now downstairs we just got 1 by 1, so it's just negative 5i times I. So it's going to be negative 5i to the second, but that's not simplified. Negative 5 times negative 1 is 5. Really, it just changes the 5 to the opposite. Okay, we don't have to change the signs because I already have a positive on bottom. Okay, so negative 7 divided, that decimal, we don't want that, so just put negative 7/5. And 6 divided by 5 is a decimal, so it's just going to be 6 over 5i. You just divide them each separately now that the I is out. Okay, next one. This is going to be a lot different. It's more work. 3 plus 2i divided by 8 plus 7i. Well, we got to get the I out of the bottom, okay? Because we can't divide that as it is. Times. Now we get a game changer. This is why you label how many terms you have. You have 2 and 2. Now the bottom's got 2. It's a binomial on bottom. Here's what you do. You use what's known as the conjugate method. Conjugate. C-O-N-J-U-G-A-T-E. Conjugate method. What you do is you switch that plus to a minus, and then you put 8 and 7i. And then the top 8 minus 7i, the same thing. Okay. Okay. Now, it's more multiplying. That's about the only difference. Okay. When you have two terms on bottom, if one term on bottom, you have just I over I. But two terms on bottom, you use the conjugate method. Meaning you switch that plus to a minus and then the same terms. And watch how this is going to play out here. So top, bottom. Okay, 2 by 2, that's the FOIL. So you go 3 times 8. That means 4 products to find. 3 times negative 7i. 2i times 8. And then 2i times negative 7i. Now find the 4 products. 3 times 8 is 24. That's simplified, obviously. 3 times negative 7i is negative 21i. That's in simplest form. And then we get 16i. That's in simplest form. Then negative 14i to the second, which is not in simplest form because that's negative 14 times negative 1, which is 14. Now it's in simplest form. So on top, 24 plus 14 is 38. And then negative 21 plus 16 is negative 5. Okay. Now you're like, well, the bottom, that's a 2 by 2 as well. 8 times 8. 8 times negative 7i. 7i times 8. And then 7i times negative 7i. Okay. 64. Negative 56i, positive 56i, and then negative 49i to the second. Now all these are in simplest form, but the bottom, negative 49i to the second, that's going to be negative 49 times negative 1, okay, and that's 49. Now, funny thing happens here. This is why you do the conjugate method. 64 plus 49 is 105. Oh, excuse me, 113. I wasn't even close. Negative 56 plus 56 is 0, so they cancel. And that's why you use the conjugate method. Those middle two are always going to cancel. Now we can actually divide. Not much, though. Decimal, keep that in fraction form. 38 over 113. Decimal, keep it in fraction form. Negative 5i over 113. There it is. Okay, next problem. Negative 2i, 1 plus I. You put a 1 in front of that I right there. Okay. So, that has one term. That has 2 terms, but the bottom is what drives what we multiply by. If we have 2 terms on bottom, it is not just I over I. 2 terms on bottom means I use the conjugate method. So I switch the plus to a minus, and it's 1 minus 1i. And that has 2 terms. Now the top, I just copy the bottom. And now I go find my products. A 1 by 2, that's just 2 products to find. So negative 2i times 1. and then negative 2i times negative 1i. So that's going to be negative 2i, which is in simplest form, and then negative times negative is a positive 2. I to the second, not in simplest form, so 2 times negative 1, negative 2. Now it's in simplest form. So negative 2 plus negative 2i. That's your top. Now on bottom, it's a 2 by 2. That's the FOIL method, okay? So 1 times 1. 1 times negative 1i. 1i times 1. And then 1i times negative 1i. So that gives me a product of 1. That gives me a product of negative 1i. These are simplified here. That gives you a product of 1i. Okay, those are like terms, but they're opposites, so they're just going to add to 0, so we cancel them. 1 times negative 1 is negative 1i to the second, so it's negative 1 times negative 1, which is 1. 1 plus 1 then gives me 2. Okay, negative 2 divided by 2 is negative 1. Negative 2 divided by 2 is also negative 1. And there's your quotient, okay? Okay, 2 plus 3i divided by 1 minus 4i, okay? Now, to know what you're multiplying by, you got to label how many terms you have. You have 2 up here and 2 down here. The bottom is the important part. Okay, 2 terms on bottom is the conjugate method. Conjugate method's when you switch your minus to plus and have the same 2 terms. And then you got to copy the same thing right here. Because you have to, when you multiply by a fraction, it's got to be the same thing on top that it is on bottom, equivalence. So they're both 2 by 2. You got to do the FOIL method on each side. So 2 times 1, 2 times 4i. 3i times 1, and then 3i times 4i. Now you can go set up the bottom if you want, it's up to you, but that's going to be 2, that's in simplest form, 8i simplified, 3i simplified. We can't get rid of those 2, they're not opposites. That's 12i to the second. I to the second is negative 1, so it's negative 12, okay? Now you can have your top 2 and negative 12 add up to negative 10. Then 8i, 3i is 11i. Okay. Now the bottom, 1 times 1 is 1 times 1. 1 times 4i. Negative 4i times 1. And then negative 4i times positive 4i. Okay, good things are going to happen when I use conjugate. Because that's 4i, but that one's negative 4i. So there's no point in adding them together because they add to 0. That's why you use conjugate method. And then negative 16i to the second, but of course that's negative 16 times negative 1, which is 16. Okay, and then 1 plus 16 just gives me 17. So negative 10 divided by 17 decimal, so just put negative 10 over 17. 11 divided by 17 is a decimal, so just put 11i over 17. So it's been divided technically, and that's my quotient. Okay, next one, 5 minus 2i divided by 3 plus 4i. Okay, 5 minus 2i divided by 3 plus 4i. Okay, so what do we multiply? Well, it depends on how many terms. That has 2. We don't really care how many terms the top has when we're deciding what to do here. It's all about the bottom. Okay, two terms on bottom means we have to apply the conjugate method. Means you make that into a minus and then 3 minus 4i. And then 2 by 2. They're both FOIL. They're both 2 by 2. 5 times 3. 5 times negative 4i. Negative 2i times 3. And then negative 2i times negative 4i. Okay, find the products. 15, negative 20i, negative 6i, and 8i to the second. Okay, so I to the second. These are all in simplest form. It's that last one. You got to take 8 times negative 1, negative 8. Okay. Okay, so combine the tops. 15 negative 8 would make 7. Negative 20 plus negative 6 is negative 26i. Okay, and that's a 2 by 2. So 3 times 3. 3 times negative 4i. 4i times 3. And then 4i times negative 4i. So it's 9, negative 12i, positive 12i. Why don't you just, when you get opposites of the same thing, they just cancel. Okay? Negative 16i to the second. So that's negative 16 multiplied by negative 1, and that's 16. So 9 plus 16 is 25. Okay, now we can divide. 7 divided by 25 is decimal, so we just put 7/25. And that's a decimal too, so just negative 26i over 25. Okay, time to work on the assignment. There's 4 problems. That's just one term on bottom. That's just I over I. Okay. One term on bottom. That would be just I over I. When we get to the ones with 2 terms on bottom, that's when you have to apply the conjugate method.